Are you following?
Yeah.
Okay. Then let me share my screen once again. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
So basically, we've set up a Laravel application, brand new Laravel application, which we are going to use to do this demo with HTTP faking. So basically, when your system needs to hit an external API to fetch data or to submit data to it for some processing of sorts, you don't always need the exact API endpoints to be able to do this. But then if you understand the APIs you need to hit and then the payload, the responses that you should be expecting, then it becomes easier. Are you getting me? It becomes easier for you to fake a response, an HTTP call to that API endpoint. That way you write your tests for it. And eventually, when you place in the right URL, you have the assurance that your system is always going to work. So since we've set up we are going to also set up a Pest, which we are going to use as our testing framework. So basically, we are trying to practice TDD here. And let me cd into our test API. Paste the command here to install Laravel Pest, which is our PHP testing framework. No. Oh, sorry. I should have said yes. Let me do this again. Okay. Pardon me. Like you see the question that was asked, do you trust to execute code and do you wish to enable it? And I chose no. So I'm going to remove the vendor folder and do this again. Okay, no worries. So now I'm going to copy and paste this to install it specifically for Laravel itself. Setting it up. And then I will run the PHP artisan pest install. No, this is what I actually wanted to respond no to. So this has been done. And now if I run event bin tests, and it's going to run the default test examples, which comes with Laravel by default. So now let's open this in Visual Studio Code, VS Code. Okay. So we have something like this, and we go to our test directory, and let me delete this because we don't need it. Then come to our feature tests. So we'll maintain this one, for instance. So basically, we are just trying to use this API, the JSON placeholder, to fetch a couple of users and then transform it and return that response. So it's as if we are trying to fetch this from an external API, then we will transform it in whatever format we need and then submit it to a user that's requesting. So I'm going to take this and then we'll convert it to PHP array so that it's easier to work with. So we say JSON to PHP array. Use this website to make my work easier. There are several tools you can always use for that. Okay, so I'll say convert. If it's correct, to simply convert it to a PHP array. Okay, so it's done and I can easily copy it. So now we are first of all going to write a test to validate this. So say that we'll call it a test and public function can get users from external API. Okay. So now this, say fake users, false this, right? So basically, you know from your Swagger API documentations or whichever the external API is, you have an understanding of the payload you should expect, which is what we have just fetched here. And we are trying to make an API request to our endpoint. So let's go to API. This is where we are going to set up our route. And delete this, we don't need it. And we will just say if someone visits the API v1 users endpoint, then we would in turn also make a call to our external API. So now to do that, we need to set up a config, right? So let me call this an external API.php. So usually in Laravel configs, you just return an array that contains the values that you wish to be accessed. So generally, you don't want to be using the env variables in your code, which is actually bad practice. What you want to do is to load your environment variables inside of your configs and then access those values from the configs. So the configs are usually initialized when the application is being bootstrapped. So all your environment variables will be loaded to the config. And then from your application, it will just be loading from over there. So let's call this, say, external URL, right? And then let me put the default value in there, which is this. So you can choose to supply a default value or not. It doesn't really matter. But basically, what this is saying is that the system should look in your env file and find an environment variable that has this value. So this is the key, and we are looking for the value. So let me paste it in here as well. Right. So let's open the terminal. So we'll do everything from this point onwards. Okay. So if I enter the artisan tinker, which is the Laravel shell, and I do something like a config, we call the config external API. So I say dump external API to me, and I'll see the values. So you see the value of URL is JSON placeholder type code users, or you can access the nested value saying external API dot URL, then it will just return that for you. And that is what we are going to use. So now we'll come back to our tests. And what we are saying is that we want to hit a particular endpoint on our system. So if I say make a JSON request, right, to, so the method is a get request, and then the URL is, you can either use a named URL or you can just type it, hard code it. But usually it's nice to use the named URL because you can change it later on. But not to elongate this, then we'll type it manually. So I'm saying when someone hits our API v1 users endpoint, this is just the call we are making, and we expect that the response, so let's assert that the status that we'll get is 200, right? That's going to be an okay response, which means it was successful. Then let's also assert the JSON structure. That's the response type. That's the payload and the keys that it will contain. So let's say it will have something like status, and let's say it might have something like error code, and then let's finally just say data. And then the data will be an array. So that data would contain things of this nature, right? And then we can also assert that these users, so Leanne Graham and such, would be the users that will be returned from this data. So let's say users, in this case, that's returned from our API endpoint. Okay, so we'll have something like response dash JSON, and I want you to access the data, right? Dot users. Okay, so data dot users, and then we can now, this is going to be in an array format, so it doesn't really matter. So we are going to assert that assert equals that let's use the very first user. So users at index 0, and we expect that that user will have, let's say, a username, and we are going to assert that it is equal to one of these fake users. So let's say the very first one, Leon Graham, and in this case, they are using username here and email to be this. And the whole point is, in our case, we are going to transform this payload into a format that is acceptable for us. So instead of we calling it email, in this case, we will call it username. So when that response gets returned, we are trying to say that the fake users that we are playing with here, we want the first, right? The very first user, which is Leanne Graham. So we want the email to be equal to the username that we are returning. So let me explain this way. This is the original payload that we are going to get from hitting the JSON placeholder endpoint. Are you following me? Hello?
Yes, I'm following.
Okay. So this is the original sort of payload we will get from that endpoint. But then in our case, we are going to, the response we will return to our internal system that's making the call to us, we will choose to transform something like email to username instead. And then maybe we'll transform something like name to full name, right? So we'll pick this, and then let's also assert that. So let's assert that this equals, assert equals that users, very first one. Wow, my battery is low. I'm sure we will get this thing done before it's over. So let's say full name, in given what we have transformed, the full name should be equal to the original fake user's name. Right. So basically we are trying to practice TDD here. Now, if I hit this endpoint, the essence of TDD is that your test must first fail before you write the implementation, and eventually it will pass. Sorry. So let's filter and run this particular test. And then it says invalid JSON return from the route. Yes, because that API endpoint currently does not exist, or let's just say it's not returning the right JSON response. So we'll now come here and we'll say that we need the URL, and we are picking the URL from the config. And once again, you don't load environment variables in your actual code. Always put them into a config and then access it from the configs. So we have the external API dot URL, which is the URL we are accessing. And then we are saying that a response, that we are going to make an HTTP call. So which one of them should I use? Okay. So HTTP get, then let me import it, because for some reason, I don't know why it's not auto important for me. So HTTP, so it eliminates support facades, HTTP, that's the one we are using here. And we are saying, make a call to this endpoint, and then when you get a response, convert it to JSON for me, which is basically in PHP, this is going to transform it into an array. And then we are now going to format it the way we want. So we are saying that let's map over this. and we have a function that's given the number of users we get, and then the response, this response. So we say that we are passing the response and we are going to transform it, right? So now, instead, when we have something like name, we'll transform it to full name. Are you following me? So we have user, the name, will transform it to full name. Then we will have something like, what was it? Email that we are choosing to call username. So you get to transform it however much you want, and that is up to you. Wow, 10 more minutes, but hopefully we'll finish before that time. Then, okay, so now we will add one more thing. Let's say the website. So let's call it a site instead of website, just to show you that we are transforming the data we are receiving from that endpoint. And now, given that we then return a response, so we say response JSON, then we would we said we were going to return something of a structure where we wanted to have from our assertions. We said it must have status, error code, and data. So we'll pass in a status where we'll say success, then we'll say error code of say 200 and value 200. Then we will add data, and in that data we'll pass in the users. This is just trying to simplify things here. So we'll pass in the users that we have transformed. So basically, this is it, right? So now the reality is that we are not going to make an actual call to this during our test because it could become too slow. So instead, we will fake it. So we would now say HTTP fake, eliminate HTTP support. Let's fake it. And then we want to say that when someone makes a call to HTTP fake -url.com, anything that looks like that star, anything, so the wildcard, anything that looks like that, we want you to return a response of this nature where we pass in our fake users. So now what we are going to do is to also modify our config during the runtime. So what we are now saying is, if someone should ever access what we previously did here, config external API.url, which is what we are also doing in the API endpoints, this particular call, I want you to return something, give it something else. So if someone accesses external API.url in the code, then I want you to pass it something such as fake url.com/API users. So just to show you what happens, let's die and dump here so that you see that the URL that we are using is not the real thing. So URL, let me dump it here, and then we'll run the test just once more. So you see that this is instead the fake URL we are going to use. Are you following? Okay, so now let's run our test again, which is hitting the fake URL, and we've told Laravel that it should. Okay, sorry about that. We've told Laravel in this instance that when it intercepts any external call to an API of this format, then it should intercept it and instead return this particular payload that we have in here. So just to show you, we can also die and dump. Then you would see it in here before we map over it. So external, let's call it external response. Let's finish this before our time runs out. And we'll run it once more. Yes, so Laravel intercepted it. And as you can see, Leanne Graham with the username of Brett and all of that. So this is something we have told Laravel to intercept and instead give it this particular payload to return. Okay, so now we would hit it and transform it, and let's see what our API returns. So before I do any of the assertions, okay, let's just dump it out here, the transformed users, so that you see that too. So when the call has been made to the external API, this is what our response will be. So we just took that payload and transformed name to full name, we transformed email to username, and we changed site website to site. And this is what we will now be returning internally. Are you getting me? But the reality is that we have not made a single call to JSON placeholder here. We have not made any network call to it, and that's why this thing is fast. Okay, so we will now run the full test to see if it passes, and the test has passed. So now we have all the full assurance that our system works, right? And it's only using a fake URL. It's not using the real thing. It's not using anything that has been hosted anywhere. Fake URL does not exist. But then now let's host this. So let's PHP artisan serve. Let me use the full command so that's easier to follow. PHP artisan serve. And let's say I want to run this on port 2022. Okay, so our application is running on port 2022, and we will just come to our browser here before my battery runs out and before our time on Zoom runs out. So we'll say local hosts on port 2022 API v1 users. And this is what we have. So this is now making the real call to the JSON placeholder endpoint, and it's transforming it for us. But then in order to be able to have the confidence that our system works, we had to write a test using a fake URL that does not exist, but only going off on the notion and the knowledge that when we hit that external API endpoint, this is the format of the payload that we should be expecting. So we now made the call saying that hit a fake URL, intercept it, and this is the response that we know it should return, and then transform it in whatever way we want. And then we can assert that this actually works. So with the fake URL, our test passes. And then when we host it using the real deal, the real URL. So just to show you that this is the real deal, let's dump it out here. And let's say URL once again. And just so that we have the confidence that we are hitting the real deal. Hit this, you see, this is actually hitting the JSON placeholder users endpoint, which is this that we expect. So let's take out the dump once more and rerun this. Just once more, just once more. Our time is up. And then it makes the call on our behalf. So you see that it's slow is because it's making an external call. And this time around, you see the number of users we have. We have about 10 users. So you see Patricia, Lepsak, Chelsea, Dietrich, and all of these people. We don't have them in our tests. And this is where you are getting from. Okay, so we are left with about 2 minutes more. I mean, if there are any questions, I think we may have to get them answered on a different platform where we have more time. Okay, that's it.
Okay, so excuse me. So the first question is, I think most of the logic to return the response, say you did it in the route. So
Yes.
I want to understand why. Is it because we are doing tests that we wrote all these things in the route? Because I know that mostly we use only route to define maybe where the application has to go, and then we do the logic in the controller, whatever.
Yes, it's bad practice to do this. This is for demo purposes. I didn't want to create a controller and make this whole thing complex.
All right, got it. Now, second thing is the API response structure. You see, you use status, error code, and data.
Yes.
So instead of error code, let's make it maybe code, because error code is like it's only targeting a particular or a category of error. It's code. Like when you say error code,
Yes.
right? So it means that I'm not okay. From my perspective, I'm not expecting 200 there. Yes.
I think it's less with less
Yes,
than 1 minute.
Chief.
We'll make it a conference call so that you can ask more questions.
Okay.
Then, Rich, I think you can, the video recorded, you can just drop it on the WhatsApp platform so that
Okay.